The discography of Porcupine Tree could best be described as having three distinct eras. There's the psychedelic space rock era, the alternative era, and the metal era. And then there's the reunion album Closure Continuation, which kinda sticks out like a sore thumb now. Of course, these eras aren't quite as cut and dry as some might perceive them to be. For instance, Lightbulb Sun contains a lot of the more metallic, crunchy riffs that would eventually make their way into the band's breakthrough album, In Absentia. Then there's The Incident, which, while containing elements of the previous three records, actually dials back a lot of the heaviness in favor of a more diverse musical approach. And whether that approach works is certainly up for debate. But there's one record that seems to blend aspects of all three eras together, all while possessing its own unique identity in the process. Today, we're talking about Signify. Let's begin by introducing the man himself. Porcupine Tree is the brainchild of one Steven Wilson, a man who has dipped his toes into countless projects. Blackfield, No Man, Base Communion, Incredible Expanding Mindfuck. Yeah, he actually had a project under that name. Storm Corrosion, his ever-expanding solo career. The list goes on. Whatever you want to say about Wilson, and trust me, the reception of his work can be quite polarizing, one thing you can't deny is that he rarely stays complacent. The dude has experimented with progressive rock, prog metal, alternative rock, psychedelia, pop, electronic music, and many other genres. And of course is an absolute workaholic on top of that. In any case, throughout his lengthy career, he's put out some of my all-time favorite records, such as Hand Cannot Erase and Grace for Drowning. I'll venture further into Wilson's other accomplishments in a different video, but before we get to the main event, let's briefly discuss what led to an album like Signify in the first place. Don't worry, this will just be the Cliff Notes version. But yeah, early Porcupine Tree is a far cry from the band who would eventually make records like In Absentia and Deadwing. In fact, they basically weren't even a band at all. It was mainly just Wilson and a cast of guest musicians, several of whom would go on to form the group's first proper lineup. We'll get to that last part in a sec. On top of that, the music was very different as well. Early to mid-90s Porcupine Tree was largely driven by psychedelic space rock, trippy atmosphere, expansive arrangements, extended improv sections, all that jazz. And while On the Sunday of Life was a decent enough debut, Up the Downstair and The Sky Moves Sideways are the albums that really solidified this approach. If I could come up with a comparison point here, imagine if 70s era Pink Floyd and late 80s Ozric Tentacles had a baby. That's a good way to describe a lot of Wilson's pre-Signify work. Getting back to the lineup situation, The Sky Moves Sideways shares a crucial similarity with Signify, the musicians who performed on it. Colin Edwin on bass, Richard Barbieri on keyboards, Chris Maitland on drums, and of course, Wilson himself. Yep, Wilson finally found the lineup he'd be working with for the next three albums. And two of those members would be there all the way until the band's hiatus in 2010. But while The Sky Moves Sideways was technically billed as Porcupine Tree's first band effort, a good chunk of the record is still performed primarily by Wilson, and in some cases entirely by him, with the rest of the members filling in the cracks where needed. And this is one of the big reasons I consider Signify such a big breakthrough for the band, as it was the first Porcupine Tree album to be built by every member from the ground up. And boy does it feel like it. Obviously Wilson is still the main mastermind behind these songs, but the contributions of the other members really lend a more cohesive and unified feel to the experience. And while Signify is technically not a concept album, its overall structure and track order do seem to suggest a greater narrative at play. From what I've gathered over the years, the biggest theme of this record is that of religious corruption and evangelism. Some songs make it as obvious as their titles, such as the instrumentals Intermediate Jesus and Idiot Prayer, while other songs are a bit more subtle with their messaging, like Sleep of No Dreaming and Sever. But regardless of what the theme is, one thing is for certain: this is some dense, heady, dark prog that thrives on atmosphere, and the overall mood of the record makes itself apparent from the very first track, Born Live Die. After a radio host tells you to kick back and relax, you're immediately plunged into a chilling soundscape, rife with lush keys and strange effects. It's a really compelling way to start a record, and lets the listener know that things will be a bit different this time around, compared to previous albums. And if that weren't obvious enough already, the track that follows will certainly do the trick. Yeah, turns out that whole kick back and relax bit is meant to lull you into a false sense of security, as the title track is an upbeat rocker with heavy riffs and aggressive drumming. Serving as a small prelude to the band's 2000s material. Little side note here, but check out the various live versions of the song for a cool extended outro, complete with some off-kilter rhythms, as well as cool guitar and bass interplay. With that said, the title track is actually quite the outlier on this record. Sure, some of the other songs ratchet up the intensity here and there, especially during Sever, as well as the second half of Dark Matter, but much of Signify is spent on sonic explorations, many of which range from the relaxing to the downright unsettling. And the arrangement of the track list is absolutely brilliant, as the tight lyric-driven pieces and the expansive instrumentals are balanced out wonderfully. For every lovely ballad like Every Home Is Wired, you could also get an eerie ambient number like Light Mass Prayers. For every loud raucous tune like Sever, you could also get a moody interlude like Pagan. Or, for a more direct one-to-one comparison, we could look at the double feature that is Waiting. These songs are two sides of the same coin as they use the same general motif, but in completely different ways. Part 1 is a somber, power ballad I guess I would call it, that contrasts soft melancholic verses with eruptive solo sections. Meanwhile, Part 2 takes the sound and style of Part 1 and transforms it into a moody instrumental. The track is a roller coaster of dynamics, and I'm glad the group allowed the music to do all the talking here. Sometimes you can tell a compelling story or narrative without even saying a single word, and Waiting Part 2 is a prime example of this. And while we're talking about two sides of the same coin, I would also apply that phrase to the aforementioned Intermediate Jesus and Idiot Prayer. As I said before, both tracks are instrumental. However, they convey totally different moods. I suppose the preacher samples in Intermediate Jesus could be considered unsettling, but to me, the song is actually quite relaxing overall. It's just the four guys laying down an awesome groove, and laying some cool melodies and effects on top of it. But Idiot Prayer? Man, this song is pretty damn unnerving at times. When I was younger, I would actually get anxious listening to the dreamlike middle section, because I knew that menacing bass and drum groove would kick back in. I just didn't know when it would kick back in, so that feeling of anticipation was pretty intense. But like Intermediate Jesus, this is just a killer piece of music. It brings plenty of musical experimentation to the table, while never really going too far or flying off the rails. It's tight and controlled, yet remains a sonic and compositional treat. However, it's in the shorter, more cohesive songs that we start to hear what Porcupine Tree would soon become. Songs like Sleep of No Dreaming, Waiting Phase 1, and Every Home Is Wired help indicate the direction that Wilson would take for many of his future projects. A direction that combines his penchant for prog's complexity with a more accessible and emotional approach. Every Home Is Wired is probably the best example here, as the first half sounds like it was taken straight out of 2000's Lightbulb Sun. And while admittedly Sleep of No Dreaming and Sever are probably a bit more strange and obtuse compared to the band's later work, they do still contain memorable hooks, and in the case of the latter, killer vocal harmonies. Now, before we get to the magnificent mini-epic that closes Signify, I want to take this opportunity to highlight the band members. As I said, Signify was the first Porcupine Tree record that had all the musicians on board from the very beginning. And needless to say, their increased presence is so welcome here. Everyone gets plenty of time to shine. So let's go down the list, shall we? First up is Colin Edwin. His bass work is incredibly prominent throughout all of Signify, and expertly walks that fine line between groove and technical prowess. On some songs, he's just laying down a simple part like a musical anchor, such as on Sever or the second half of Every Home is Wired. But on tracks like Intermediate Jesus, Idiot Prayer, and Sleep of No Dreaming, he takes on a much more active role. Idiot Prayer takes the cake for me here, as it simply wouldn't be the same without Edwin's ominous yet nimble bass lines leading the way. Then there's Chris Maitland, who I've always seen as a bit overlooked. Granted, I suppose it doesn't help that Gavin Harrison of all people was his replacement, but Maitland definitely had his share of highlights during his run with the band. As far as his work on Signify goes, the standouts to me are the title track, Waiting Part 2, and Intermediate Jesus. Man, I'm bringing that song up a lot. Just goes to show how good the musicianship is. Maitland was never the flashiest drummer out there, but ironically enough, I think his more subtle approach really helps him gel with the other members musically. To me, however, the real MVP of Signify, other than Wilson, is Richard Barbieri. Not only is he the main keyboardist of the record, but much of the album's dark, disturbing atmosphere comes from the various tapes and sequencers that he throws into the mix. You can tell that he and Wilson had an absolute field day playing around with their little gizmos and gadgets to achieve the desired ambiance of each track. And that's how he got such dense and compelling sonic locales throughout. For me, one of the biggest standouts in this regard is Sever. The crazy synths and loops in this song create an environment that's equal parts chaotic and claustrophobic, lending an air of tension to a record that's usually quite spacious and panoramic. So now, let's cap this all off with what I, and many others, consider to be the big highlight of Signify, Dark Matter. This is the culmination of what Porcupine Tree had accomplished up to this point, and still remains one of their finest tracks in general. The song has everything: soft moody verses, thought-provoking lyrics, off-kilter rhythms, lush vocal harmonies, and of course an explosive finale that gives all that build-up a proper payoff. And therein lies those key words: build-up and payoff. This tune is a masterclass in ebb and flow, tension and release. And for that, it earns every second of its 9-minute runtime. Even if you don't end up checking out Signify as a whole, at least give this track a listen. You'll be glad you did. You know, it feels like there's kind of a weird stigma surrounding transitional albums. This notion that because a record doesn't fully fit into one era or another, it's somehow lackluster in the grand scheme of things. But those transitional qualities can also be what gives a record its charm and make it stand out among the pack. Not only is Signify my favorite Porcupine Tree record, but there's simply no other Porcupine Tree album like it. It has elements of each era, though predominantly the Psych era, I need to make that clear, but much of the track list wouldn't really feel at home on the band's other records. Signify may have its share of prominent influences. Hell, I didn't even bring up the krautrock elements earlier. But it still feels wholly unique because of the atmosphere and weird little songwriting quirks it brings to the table. And considering I almost never see it get mentioned alongside In Absentia or Fear of a Blank Planet as one of their best albums, I think I can safely call it underrated. Seriously, if you haven't listened to Signify yet, check it out when you get the chance. It's an absolute classic of 90s prog, as well as one of Steven Wilson's finest efforts, in and out of Porcupine Tree. Hey everyone, as always, thanks for watching. Porcupine Tree's been one of my favorite bands for a really long time, so it was awesome to finally get to cover them here. Also, I can't thank you guys enough for the reception my last Dream Theater video got. I honestly wasn't expecting it to get so much viewership and feedback, so I really appreciate that. Also, I want to apologize real quick for the slow output of my channel. I was intending to ramp up production after the Dream Theater video, but life got in the way and it became difficult to maintain an actual schedule. But I'm aiming to improve on this front as we go into 2025, so stay tuned. As I always say at the end, if you like what you saw, please consider liking and subscribing. Thank you, and I will see you in the next one.